Well, it's that time of year again where us booktubers like to talk about our favorite books of the year. And here is my video for my favorite books of 2024. Now, I can see this glare in my glasses. I hope that doesn't bother you. Really not a lot I can do about that where I need to be right now. So anyway, I just wanted to tell you what my favorite books out of the between 82 and 86 books I read this year. And the reason there's a little bit of confusion there is because the app that I use to count Storygraph, it doesn't count rereads, or at least I can't figure out how to count rereads. And so I know I read a few more books, but I'm not counting rereads on this anyway. So 82 books. Out of the 82 books I read this year, these are my favorite. We'll say top 10. And all that basically means is the order in which I enjoyed them the most. I enjoyed all the books. So number 10 isn't a lot less than number 1 as far as probably the quality of the book. In fact, some would argue that it's more better quality. But as far as my level of enjoyment, these are the 10 that I enjoyed the most this year, and then the ascending order from there, or ascending order. So first of all is, don't you love that cover, Dracula. Dracula is number 10 for me. I tried to read more classics this year. It was a goal of mine, and I didn't read near as many as I wanted to, but I did read a few, and this was one of the ones I picked up. Now, just like last year when I read Frankenstein, this is not exactly what I was expecting in a great way. So I didn't realize that Dracula was set up in journal entries, which I feel like maybe in another book or another situation that may not have worked well for me, but it worked very well for me in this. It was fun from beginning to end. Of course, there's the dark nature of what Dracula is, but ultimately it becomes a vampire hunt. And if that's something that you enjoy in movies or in stories, that's exactly what this is. Frankenstein last year was very different because I thought I associated more with what the movies Frankenstein had become, which was just about a monster. But really, it was something very different than that. This is obviously about a monster, one of the most famous monsters that there is, but it was just a very fun read, and I enjoyed being in the minds of the people who were telling the story through journal entries and through newspaper clippings and letters and things like that. It was very fun, and I enjoyed Dracula. Next on my list, and I don't know exactly how this is going to go for us, if these books are going to fall over, this is unedited, is Dune. I had heard Mike from Mike's Book Reads and others talk about Dune. I believe this is one of his favorite books, and if not his top favorite book. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to read it this year. This is, because you may consider this a classic as well. But anyway, I decided I was going to read this, and I don't know exactly how to label this. So, I know there's a lot of people, the way they think about science fiction and fantasy. This feels like Star Wars to me. And some label Star Wars science fiction, some label it fantasy, sci-fantasy, something like that. Well, that's how I would label this. It's very, you have wizards. You have things like that. You have mythical creatures that come out from the earth. And it just felt like fantasy. It may be sci-fi. I'm not really going to argue that point. But it felt like fantasy. And I enjoyed it. Fantasy is the main genre that I read. So I really enjoyed this. Of course, in the last couple of years, the movies have come out, the new movies, and I wanted to watch them, but I didn't want to watch them before I read the book. And so I did. First thing in January, I read the book, then I went back and watched the movies, and I enjoyed my time in this. It is more challenging of a read. Of course, you hear that all the time from people some who DNF it, some people who don't like it. They talk about it being a challenging read, and it was a challenging read. But not so challenging that it's not understandable. It was a very good story. I enjoyed the layout of it. I enjoyed the characters. Now, as you read further on in the series, which I've read the next book, you begin to see some nuance a little more nuance in, especially the main couple of characters, where is he a hero? Is he anti-hero? Reading this, I felt like he was a hero. You read the next book, and I've even started reading a little bit more of the next book, of the third book, and I can see what people are saying with that. But anyway, I enjoyed this book. That's why it's my number 9 favorite book of this year. Probably could be higher, but when I sat down and figured it out, I had to rework books, and this ended up at number 9 for me. And for number 8, this is a book that changed. When I made this list, this wasn't included on my top 10. And then I noted, and I thought I was satisfied with how my top 10 had fallen out. And then I looked at this book, and I saw it on my shelf, and I thought, oh, I love that book. And began to think about my top 10 list, and I had to include it. In fact, it bumped another book off, and it took its place at my number 7 position, and that is Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia. Don't know a ton about the author, but I can say this: he writes an enjoyable story. I've heard several book influencers, booktubers talk about this book and talk about many books that he's written. This isn't the only series. I think he has a few series. Monster Hunters International, and then people talk about how fun that is. Well, this was a story that just, it was so fast-paced. Of course, it's a fantasy book, and it's not extremely long, not compared to a lot of the other chunkers on this list. So it's a quick read, an engaging story. I love the world that he's building here. Of course, it's not a fun world. It's not a world where I would like to be as far as the way people live and the restrictions that they are under. But to read about, it was very fascinating. I'm not going to give away too much about it in case you haven't read it. I don't want to step into spoilers. But anyway, so people are the law is king. The law is number one. And whatever you do, you don't break the law, because if you break the law, there are enforcers who come out and they dispense justice in very harsh ways. But the story goes, just there's one of these particular keepers of the law, one of these particular defenders of the law, who the story takes place in his life, and things change for him, and I enjoy his journey in this book. So, number 7 for me, Son of the Black Sword. That was number 8. Now number 7. So, this is another thing that was difficult. I've read 3 Malazan books so far by Stephen Erickson, and all 3 of them had this position at one time or the other, because I couldn't make up my mind. I wanted to choose the first book because it was a great introduction to the story and this world. Again, this is another one that's very challenging. People like to say he doesn't hold your hand in the writing of this book, and I would say that's true. But it was not as difficult as I thought it was going to be. I was extremely intimidated to read these books, and have been for a couple of years now. But when I dove into Gardens of the Moon, it sucks you in. It's fascinating. And I have read the first 3. I ended up landing on Dead House Gates. And the reason I ended up landing on Dead House Gates is because for me, now, for you, if you're a fan of the series, you may have different opinions and different takes. But this hit me emotionally more than the other 2 books. Not that the other 2 books weren't emotionally impactful, because they were, and very well written. But this was the best for me in the way it tugged at my emotions, especially certain scenes with characters that I will admit I did not like and I did not care for earlier on in the book. But the more you follow them on the journey, you can't help but have respect for them. You can't help but enjoy the journey. Well, enjoy may not be the best word, but you can't help but fall in love with certain aspects of their story. And that was this for me. Chain of Dogs, I think that's what it was called. This walk through desert was brutal, but full of very rewarding moments and emotional moments. And so for that reason, this is my number 7. I'm going to end up losing count because I'm not going off a list here. I'm just going off the books that are here. This is my number 6 book. So this is my number 6 book. And again, I had a difficult, this is the most difficult time I've had with ranking books. And the reason I had trouble ranking this is because there are a number of the books in this series that I can say I enjoyed as much as the other books. And if I were going to separate them or rank them, the ranking would be difficult, especially my top favorites of the series. But I set out a couple of years ago. My father, who passed away years ago, he loved Stephen King, was his favorite author. And when I began my reading journey a few years ago, I decided I wanted to see what Stephen King's all about. So I began reading. I started with Salem's Lot, some of those books. And then I had never heard of The Dark Tower. That just wasn't something that I knew anything about. But of course, you begin to, as you watch reviews, as you read more, you realize that this is a connected universe, a connected world. And so I said, okay, well, I want to check out The Dark Tower. So I read The Gunslinger, and I enjoyed The Gunslinger, but I didn't immediately go to the next book. But eventually I did. And then when I read the second book, I continued on in the series until I was finished. But especially the last few books. Now, I enjoyed every book in the series, but especially the last few books just were so wonderful for me. I loved Wolves of the Calla. That, in fact, at the time, that may have been my favorite, though I don't think I read that this year. I think I read that last year, so that wouldn't have counted. But anyway, this year I finished it, and so I decided to go ahead and go with the last book. Now, that in itself can be somewhat controversial because I know a lot of people had issues with things that happened in this book, and I did too. This kind of symbolizes my enjoyment and love for the entire series, culminated in this. There were some things that I wish had happened differently. Some certain characters, certain villains I wish had been a little different, but I still enjoyed the heck out of this book. I was very satisfied with even the ending. There's a point towards the end where Stephen King gives you a warning. He says, now, if you want things to happen like this, stop reading. But if you want to know what actually happens, continue reading. And he just, it's crazy what he does. I'm not going to talk about it anymore, but it's crazy what he does. And it's wonderful, and it left a smile on my face, and I enjoyed this book. And I don't mean that to say that everything ended up perfectly or not. It just gets weird. And that's what Stephen King does best, is he gets weird. And that's fun. So this is my number 6 book of the year. Now I've come to my top 5. And on my top 5, I write for Fanfiaddict, book blogging site. And I've already released my top 5 on there in the last couple of weeks. But still, if you, I'd love for you to go check that out and check that site out. It's got a lot of great book bloggers with great opinions. So you can go check that out. But I would still want to include them in this top 10. These are my favorites. So I'll put that on my channel. For number 5, you probably already saw what it was. It is Of War and Ruin by Ryan Cahill. This is a series that I started last year that I just enjoyed so much. Mike from Mike's Book Reads is the reason I started reading a lot of books. He definitely influenced this, but I had heard of this before, prior to him talking about it. In fact, he finished it long before I did. It took me a lot longer. But we started the fall. He started with the fall. I started with the fall. And we started right around the same time. I'd already made up my mind that I was going to read it. And I've loved every entry. I've loved every book. I love these characters, their journey, the character work, all of these things I enjoy. This is the last book that's been released so far, book number 3. In fact, book number 4 is coming out in the next few months. It is probably the most highly anticipated book for 2025 for me. And Of War and Ruin. Now, this is the longest book. It was, I know it's over 1,000 pages. It's over 1,000 pages. And it doesn't feel like it, though. It looks like it. I have a friend who's been kind of putting off reading it because they say they're intimidated by it because of its length. But my goodness, the story, what he does in this, it continues to get better. Book 1 starts off, and it's a very traditional fantasy story. Hero's journey. A young boy who loves the place where he lives is taken out of that place by some event, and you begin to follow this young country boy's journey. And it's a very dragon riding, a lot of familiar tropes, though it was very good. Then book 2, the author kind of starts doing his own things. And then with the novellas, you're keeping up with, he's keying in on specific characters. But again, he's just doing his own thing now. And it gets better and better up to this book. And this was very early on in 2024 when I read this. But this is my favorite of the series so far. And I hope the fourth book is my favorite. I hope that's how that turns out. But right now, as it stands, this is my favorite of the series. Again, I don't want to get into any spoilers. I wouldn't want to do that. But just, and I can't really talk about, I'm kind of stumbling over what I want to talk about because I can't really talk about the things that happened in the first few books without giving spoilers. But if you love classic fantasy, now there is some language in this. I say that because you may like your classic fantasy without any adult content, any language or like anything like that. Well, this does have a good bit of language, but I don't think it's overpowering. I don't think it overtakes the story. But very, very good book. And this, for me, was my number 5 favorite read of this year. Now for number 4. And now we get into some interesting things for me personally. Because I have had quite the journey with this particular author. And I've actually talked about this in a few previous videos, if you go back and watch them. With this book, this is a series that I DNF'd. I DNF'd this at book 2, The Well of Ascension, because the first 50% of that book, I didn't care about what it was talking about. I wasn't invested in it. I liked book 1. I did not like up to 50% of book 2. And so I put it down. I put it down for a long while. In fact, I began reading it in 2023. But then this year I started reading the Stormlight Archive. And with that, I ran across some spoilers of things that happened, probably not in this book, but in the last book. And I thought, you know what? I got to finish it just so I can know the full scope of what's happening in the rest of the Stormlight Archive. So I did. I came back to this. I finished it. I will say this, the back half of this book was a lot, not this book, of Well of Ascension. I finished the Well of Ascension, and the back half was a lot better than the first half. Of course, and then you have the last couple of 100 pages, which is the Sanderlanche. We all know that gets exciting. And then I picked this book up, The Hero of Ages. And I can say this without any reservations, because now I have finished the Stormlight Archive, finished Wind and Truth earlier this month. This is my favorite Sanderson book, bar none, of the Cosmere. I don't think I've read anything outside of the Cosmere yet. But this is my favorite Cosmere book. I love the characters, which I don't always love Sanderson characters. Specifically, the female character, Vin, which I have issues, and I talked about that in previous videos. I have some issues with Sanderson's way of writing female characters. I mentioned they feel plastic to me, but not Vin. Vin is an exception to that. The other characters are an exception to my probably not popular opinions on Sanderson's writing. Then I've told you I completed the Stormlight Archive. Wasn't a huge fan. I wasn't a huge fan, I'll say this, of Wind and Truth, because I assumed he was going to do it like this. Of course, there was a bit of a lull in the middle of the series, but then he finished it out with an amazing, emotionally impactful ending, which for some people he did, and that's fine. For me, it fell flat because it doesn't come close to what he did in this book. Again, my favorite Cosmere book, my favorite Brandon Sanderson book, and it is number 4 on my favorite books of the year. Now, number 3. This is special to me because this is my 3rd favorite book of the year that I read this year, but this may be my favorite series. I won't know until I finish it. I'm not finished with the entire series. It's a large series, but I have so enjoyed this author's writing, storytelling, and I often feel bad because well, you like what you like, and there's nothing wrong with that. Most of the books that I read are fantasy. Most of the authors I read are men. And so I don't have a lot of experience with a lot of different female authors. I have more this year than ever before, and I'm glad of that. It was one of my goals. But this author, Robin Hobb, is pushing to become one of my top authors, if not my top favorite author. And the Realm of the Elderlings is my favorite series. I have so enjoyed this. This is book 3 of the Tawny Man, but it's book, I believe, 9 of the Realm of the Elderlings. I actually messed up one time and I called Tawny Man Fits in the Fold. Yeah, Tawny Man. I put a post on Twitter and I called it Fits in the Fold, and someone said, I didn't realize you finished the whole series. Well, I haven't, just Tawny Man. I just called it by the wrong name. So this book, of course, we're following Fitz and his friends. It's a first-person narrative, but of course, she has a way of writing that even though it's all from his perspective, you still get so connected with the other characters through the understanding and mind and perspective of Fitz. This is, again, the conclusion of the Tawny Man trilogy, so there's not a lot I can say that wouldn't be spoiler, except to say just about the book and about the writing. It's my favorite. I love everything she's doing so far. I'll say this. I've been nervous about moving on to the next series, the second to last series, just because of things I've heard. I've heard it's more like a Y romance. I don't know if that's accurate, but I've heard someone say that. So I've been kind of nervous about getting to the next one. It's a dragon series, but I'm going to read it, and I'll probably enjoy it because of how well she writes. So, Fool's Fate. And I'll also say this about Fool's Fate. You can probably hear a dog barking in the background. I'll say this about Fool's Fate. I wish this was the conclusion. This is the conclusion I want Fitz to have. And so I'm nervous about what comes next. That's my third favorite book of the year. My second favorite book of the year, and quickly, like I've talked about Robin Hobb, quickly becoming one of my favorite authors. I've been reading in the Realm of the Elderlings over a couple of years now, about a year and a half. Well, I just picked up this author this year for the first time. And I am amazed with how much I've enjoyed his writing, and that is John Gwynne, and this book is Wrath. Someone mentioned the other day, because I talked about Wrath being one of my favorite books, and I didn't mention either Bloodsworn on that list, Bloodsworn Saga. As a series, I probably enjoy the Bloodsworn Saga more than The Faithful and The Fallen as a series. But as one particular book, just one entry, Wrath is my favorite John Gwynne book. And I believe that's because in Faithful and the Fallen, I read the first book, I believe it was Malice. It wasn't my favorite. It was, for me, good enough to want to continue the series. But even when I read it, I was thinking to myself, this just is not, it's been hyped up a lot more than what I was expecting. And then you read book 2, and book 2 is better. In my opinion, book 2 is better than Malice. And then you hit book 3, Ruin. I don't think I've ever seen a jump that high in quality and story and characters as you saw from book 3, from book 2. It was outstanding. And I assumed that would be my favorite book. And then he did it again. He did it again with Wrath. These characters live with me in my mind constantly. Their stories, their arcs, all of these things that happen to them. There's a particular character that I don't even remember from the first couple of books. I know he was there, but I don't remember a lot about him. But then in the last 2 books, especially in this book, he just becomes one of my favorite characters of the series. And especially the end, the very end, it is just outstanding. John Gwynne is top of the line for me. So far, my favorite author of all time is Tolkien. John Gwynne is the only author that challenges that for me. Not saying he's dethroned Tolkien in my mind. Favorite living author, John Gwynne. So, wonderful stuff. Wrath is my number 2 book of the year. Excuse me. And my number 1 book of the year. So last year, like I've said, most of the books that I read are fantasy. And that's still my genre. But last year, it was not a fantasy book that was my book of the year. It was historical fiction or Western, Lonesome Dove. Still to this day, I would say the best book I've ever read. This year, I didn't think that was going to happen until in July when I read this book. And within the first few chapters, I thought this is my favorite. This is the favorite book I read this year, and I assumed that it would be be defeated by somebody. I just assumed it would, because there were some highly anticipated books that came after that, but it didn't. Just as a story, a story in whole, I did not enjoy or have as good of experience with any other book as I had with this particular book. And that book is two books in one, but Boy's Life by Robert McCammon. This is just, you follow this, it's a coming of age story. You follow this boy over the period of a year. It's broken up into the seasons of the year, the parts of the book is. And so as you go through this book, you're following not only the life, things that are going on in his life, tragedies that are happening, growth that's happening, troubles, and that's my favorite kind of a story. And you find that here in Boy's Life. This cover is coming apart in my hands. So I just didn't enjoy anything as much as I enjoyed this year. And I am excited about reading more Robert McCammon after I read this one. And so these are my top 10 books of the year. Again, I wasn't expecting a non-fantasy to take the number one spot again, but it did. It just happens sometimes. So what were your favorite books of the year? I've been enjoying watching other people or listening to other people or reading what they're saying. What are your favorite books of the year? Thank you for listening. Until next time, go read books.